6 hours on the water, not a single bite. The rod stays bent only from the weight of disappointment. Meanwhile, 50 yards down the bank, someone with a beat-up rod and a lure that belongs in a dollar bin is hauling fish out like the lake owes him money. Same water, same weather, same time of day. So what does that angler know that 90% of fishermen will never figure out? The answer is not a lure. It is not a technique. It is a visible, physical signal that appears on the surface of the water. A signal so reliable that ancient fishing cultures on 3 separate continents built their entire traditions around it. And the modern tackle industry has zero financial incentive to teach it to you. This is Forbidden Lures, the channel that hands you the biological hacks, the underground science, and the environmental secrets that turn average anglers into absolute predators on the water. Subscribe now, because what you are about to learn will permanently change how you look at every lake, river, and pond you ever fish again. Here is the promise. When you understand this one water condition, a $2 grocery store bait will outfish a $30 custom swim bait. Every single time. Stay until the end. This goes deeper than you think. Part 1. The $40 billion blind spot. The recreational fishing industry in the United States generates over $40 billion a year. That is not a typo. 40 billion. And every dollar of it depends on one assumption, that catching fish requires buying the right product. Think about it. The newest crankbait, the upgraded scent additive, the lighter rod, the smoother reel. Sponsored videos show an influencer pulling a trophy bass on a brand new topwater plug, and your brain makes the connection. That lure catches fish. But notice what those videos never show. They never show the 20 minutes that angler spent reading the water before making a single cast. They never explain how that person chose that exact spot, because that knowledge is free, and free knowledge does not sell sponsorships. Here is what the economics of the fishing industry do not want you to understand. Almost any lure works when it lands in the right spot. And the right spot is not just a sunken log or a depth change on your fish finder. The right spot is a temporary, highly localized biochemical hotspot where the water itself is driving fish into a feeding frenzy. The water gives you a visible signal when this is happening. You just need to know what to look for. Part 2. The breathing water. This is not a modern internet theory. This is knowledge that predates your great-grandfather's fishing rod. In Japan, freshwater artisan fishermen have exploited this exact signal for over 200 years. They call it Mizuno Iki, the breathing of the water. The old masters would not let their apprentices cast a single line until the water spoke to them first. Young students stood at the water's edge for hours, forbidden from touching a rod, learning to read the surface before ever learning to fish. Thousands of miles away in the Amazon basin, traditional riverside communities along the upper Solimões River search for the same phenomenon. They call it buia do fundo, the bubbling of the bottom. It is the very first environmental signal a young person in those communities learns to identify, long before they ever pick up fishing gear. Over in Europe, the Hungarian competitive carp fishing champions, ranked among the best bank anglers on the planet, spend hours scanning the surface for this identical visual cue before deciding where to set their rigs. 3 different cultures, 3 different continents, 3 different languages. The exact same signal. So what is it? You are looking for a very specific type of bubble. Not the large, soapy foam kicked up by wind or a boat wake, not the random splashes of raindrops. You are looking for a tiny, continuous line of bubbles, about 1 to 3 millimeters across, rising in a steady rhythm from the bottom to the surface, almost like the lake is exhaling. When you see this, The bottom sediment is releasing organic gas. It means active decomposition is happening down there. And where this is happening, fish are not just present, they are locked into aggressive, predatory hunting mode. But why? What is it about a few tiny bubbles that turns a cautious fish into a reckless predator? The answer is pure biochemistry, and it is far more powerful than anything you can buy in a tackle shop. Part 3. The biochemistry of the dinner bell. Imagine dropping a single molecule the size of a pinhead into an 800-foot-tall stack of milk cartons. One pinhead, 800 feet of cartons. A predatory fish can detect that single molecule. That is how impossibly sensitive their chemosensory system is. Here is what happens beneath the surface. The bottom of any active lake, pond, or river is a graveyard of organic matter. Dead aquatic plants, algae, sunken wood, fish carcasses, all packed into the mud and sediment. A massive army of microorganisms and bacteria work constantly to break this material down. When that decomposition process intensifies, triggered by slight shifts in water temperature, changes in barometric pressure, or bottom-dwelling creatures stirring the sediment, it releases gases, primarily methane and carbon dioxide, that bubble up to the surface. But those bubbles are not coming up empty. As they rise through the water column, they carry a concentrated cocktail of amino acids and chemical compounds straight into the surrounding water. Substances like cysteine, glycine, and proline, amino acids that act as biological fire alarms for every predatory fish in the area. Fish detect these amino acids through sensory organs called nares on their snouts, where water constantly flows over highly sensitive nerve bundles. When a largemouth bass, a trophy catfish, or a cruising trout picks up cysteine in the water, it does not casually investigate. The amino acid triggers an immediate, involuntary arousal response in the fish's brain. Glycine and proline go even further. They trigger violent striking and biting behavior. The fish's central nervous system essentially hijacks its body, switching it from resting mode directly into hyper-aggressive feeding mode. By the time you cast a lure into that rising plume of bubbles, you are not trying to convince a lazy fish to eat a piece of plastic. You are dropping bait into a zone where every predator is already hunting, already aggressive, already searching for the source of that chemical signal. You are not starting the party. You are walking into a room where the music is already at full volume. And that is only half the story, because those same bubbles carry something else. Something that makes this phenomenon even more dangerous for the fish. Part 4. The Tipsy Daredevil effect. Those decomposition bubbles carry amino acids, but they also carry carbon dioxide. And what CO2 does to a fish's brain is the secret within the secret. The reason why even cheap, ugly, mismatched lures work in these zones. When bubbles rise through the water column, they create a highly localized zone of elevated CO2. Fish swim into this zone, chasing those irresistible amino acid signals. But once inside, the elevated carbon dioxide directly interferes with a specific neurotransmitter receptor in the fish's brain called the GABA-A receptor. Normally, that receptor processes fear and caution. It is what keeps a pressured, heavily fished trophy bass from biting an artificial lure that does not look quite right. It is the reason educated fish are so maddeningly difficult to catch. But under elevated CO2, the receptor's function reverses. The fish loses its natural caution. Marine biologists who studied this phenomenon described the affected fish as tipsy daredevils. bold, reckless, aggressive. A trophy bass that would normally inspect your lure from 3 different angles and swim away now charges it without hesitation. A wary brown trout that has refused every fly in your box suddenly strikes with abandon. This is the reason any lure works in an active bubble zone. A cheap piece of hot dog on a hook, a gaudy neon spinnerbait, a $1 clearance bin plastic worm. The fish's biological caution has been chemically muted by the CO2, while its predatory aggression has been cranked to maximum by the amino acids. Fear off. Hunger on. It is the ultimate, fatal combination. Now, this phenomenon does not only happen in still water, it happens in rivers and streams too, but the signal looks different. And when you know what to look for in moving water, you unlock an entirely separate level of this advantage. Part 5. Foam is home. In moving water, the current sweeps those decomposition bubbles downstream. They gather in the seams where fast water meets slow water, forming visible streaks of dirty white or yellowish foam, what experienced river anglers call foam lines. Most fishermen walk right past them, assuming it is pollution or dirty runoff. Old-school river rats know better. They have a saying, "Foam is home." Here is the science behind the saying. The gases and amino acids released from bottom decomposition contain natural surfactants, molecules that reduce the surface tension of the water. These surfactants allow the bubbles to persist and stick together instead of popping instantly. As the river flows, it funnels these durable bubbles into the natural seams and eddies. But foam lines do more than broadcast a chemical dinner bell. The thick, sudsy surface acts like a sticky conveyor belt for insects. Spent mayflies, exhausted caddisflies, ants, grasshoppers, they all get trapped in the foam and cannot escape. And underneath that foam, a massive brown trout knows that an osprey or eagle flying overhead cannot see through that thick blanket of bubbles. The trout feels completely secure. It leaves the safety of deep undercut banks and moves up to sit just inches below the surface, right under the foam line, feeding on trapped insects while breathing in that same fear-reducing CO2. Total cover, unlimited food, chemically lowered caution. If you see a foam line swirling in a back eddy, do not walk past it. There is almost certainly a large predator sitting underneath, feeling invincible and actively feeding. Part 6. How to read the code. You understand the science now. You know why fish stack up in these zones and why they bite anything that moves. The question is, how do you actually find these spots and execute when you are standing at the water's edge? Picture this. You pull up to the lake at 6 in the morning. Do not rig your rod. Do not slam the car door. Do not stomp down to the water. Fish are incredibly sensitive to acoustic vibrations and overhead silhouettes. March straight to the bank, and every fish within 50 yards goes on high alert. Instead, stand back. Give yourself 5 full minutes of pure, silent observation. Scan the edges, the drop-offs, the weed lines. Let the water settle. Let it speak. Next, and this is critical, get low. You will never spot tiny biological bubbles standing fully upright with the sky glaring off the surface. Crouch down. Drop to one knee. Get your eyes less than 3 feet above the water. Put on polarized sunglasses with amber or copper lenses. By lowering your angle, you cut beneath the glare and use the surface as a mirror to catch subtle disturbances. You are looking for the Mizuno Iki, a sequence of small bubbles 1 to 3 millimeters wide rising from the exact same spot on the bottom. They have a pulse, a rhythm, a little cluster every 10 to 20 seconds. Do not confuse them with plant bubbles. Aquatic plants release oxygen through photosynthesis, but those bubbles are random, scattered, and irregular. Decomposition bubbles are deliberate and focused, always rising from the same point. The moment you spot them, act fast. Mentally mark the spot by lining it up with a tree or rock on the opposite bank. Cast directly onto the bubble line, not 2 feet to the left, not a yard past it, exactly on the spot. That peak feeding window is short, roughly 3 to 8 minutes in a specific zone. Drop your lure on their heads while they are fired up on amino acids and CO2, and you will get a violent strike almost immediately. If 3 perfect casts into the bubble zone produce nothing, move. Do not waste an hour flogging dead water. Wait for the next cluster of bubbles to appear, and repeat. And here is the ultimate long game move. When you find a spot that produces bubbles and fish, mark it. Drop a GPS pin on your phone. An active, decomposing bottom is a stable geological feature. If it is gassing off today, it will likely gas off tomorrow and the day after that. Over time, you are building a personal map of biological hotspots, an asset that no tackle shop in the world can sell you. Part 7. The Forbidden Rig. The Fly and Bubble. There is one scenario that frustrates anglers more than almost anything else. You find a perfect foam line on a river. You can see massive trout or bass gently sipping tiny insects trapped in the suds. You know they are there. You know their guard is down. But every spinning lure you throw crashes through the foam and spooks them instantly. And you do not own a $1,000 fly fishing setup to present a tiny dry fly. This is where one of the most devastatingly effective old-school hybrid tactics comes in: the fly and bubble rig. A method so brutally efficient at catching foam-line fish that it feels like cheating. The setup lets a standard spinning rod cast near weightless flies 60 yards across a lake or river with sniper-like accuracy. Take a clear plastic casting bubble, like the A-Just a Bubble, and thread the main line through the center tube. Fill that clear bubble about 1/3 to 1/2 full of water. The water inside gives it the mass to load a spinning rod for a long cast, but because it is clear and water-filled, it becomes practically invisible once it lands. Below the bubble, tie on a small snap swivel to stop it sliding down. Then attach 4 to 8 feet of light, clear monofilament or fluorocarbon leader. At the end of that leader, tie on a tiny artificial fly, a woolly bugger, a pheasant tail nymph, or a Griffith's gnat. Cast far upstream of the foam line. The bubble floats low and stealthy on the surface, acting as a strike indicator. The tiny fly drifts completely naturally, drag-free, right into the heart of the foam. The fish, sheltered by the bubbles overhead, stimulated by the amino acids, feeling perfectly safe, looks up and sees an easy, natural meal drifting in the current. When that clear bubble twitches, shoots sideways, or gets pulled under, set the hook. Veteran fly fishermen have been known to pack up in frustration, watching someone with a spinning rod and a plastic water bubble pull 20-inch trout out of a foam line every 5 minutes. It is an absolutely devastating technique, and it costs almost nothing to set up. Conclusion. Think about the last trip. Up before dawn, 2-hour drive, a full day under the sun, an empty cooler on the ride home. That did not happen because the lake was dead or because the tackle box was missing the right lure. It happened because the cast landed in barren, sterile water, completely blind to the feeding frenzies happening right in front of your eyes. That ends today. You now know how to locate the Mizuno Iiki. You know that when organic matter decays, it releases amino acids that hijack a fish's nervous system. You know that rising CO2 strips away a predator's fear, turning cautious fish into reckless strikers. And you know that foam lines are nature's conveyor belts, delivering food and total security to the biggest fish in the system. The next time you walk up to the water's edge, do not reach for your rod. Stop. Lower your angle, scan the surface. Find the pulse, find the bubbles. Cast exactly where the fish are already waiting. If this changed the way you think about finding fish, hit the like button. It pushes the algorithm, so more frustrated anglers can find this knowledge. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because every week this channel peels back the curtain on another industry secret that the big companies would rather keep buried. Drop a comment below. What is the biggest challenge you face when trying to locate fish on new water? Those comments shape the next video. And if you have a fishing buddy who keeps buying new gear and keeps coming home empty-handed, send this to them. The water has always been talking. Now you know how to listen. Get out there, read the signs, and never come back empty-handed again. Stay sharp, stay stealthy, and keep your lines tight.